Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a short story that was written by J.R.R. Tolkien, or Tolkien. I know my British listeners always try to correct my pronunciation, but I'm pronouncing it as an American, which is the same thing you guys do when you pronounce American names. You pronounce them as Brits. But J.R.R. Tolkien, I'm reading this from the collection of stories called Tales from the Perilous Realm. But you can find this little short story, Leaf by Niggle. You can find this online, just a Word document, single-spaced. It's about 10 pages long. You can also get it it was originally published in terms of his books in a 1964 book called Tree and Leaf. You can also get it, it's been republished as a standalone little book. I think it's like 50 pages in that little edition, which has an introduction and things. So there's a number of ways you can get at this, but it is a phenomenal little story that Tolkien wrote that is very interesting, both in terms of its content itself, but also kind of its history of how it came about and where it fits into Tolkien's overall work. So I'm excited to talk to you a little bit about talk about this a little bit with you today and share some thoughts. So I recently had the chance to reread this short story at our church. We've been having just a summer book club informally, just for some of the members, and we're going to be reading through some Wendell Berry short stories. So I'll probably be doing a review on that collection of stories in a month or two. But we started off by reading this short story, Leaf by Niggle, and so it was a great experience to reread that and to be able to discuss it with friends. I would highly commend that if that's something that you haven't really done before. We often, once we get out of school, we don't read books with people anymore. We don't discuss them, but you get so much more out of it as an adult. So I would definitely say, especially if you struggle to read or struggle to understand what you're reading, find a friend, get a couple people, sit down, have a meal, and read through something together. It'll really, really bless you. And this was very much a blessing for me. So a couple of things I want to share here. First off, because this is a short story, I don't think there's any way I can talk about the story without kind of spoiling, what goes on. So if you have not read it yet and want to just encounter it fresh, turn this video off now. But if you have not read it, it's a phenomenal little story about a painter named Niggle. And it's kind of an allegory or metaphor that Tolkien is using to explore a number of things, one of which is kind of what is the abiding value of creative work or labor? And I would suggest work or labor, generally speaking. And he kind of explores that by following this single man, kind of a quirky, reclusive type named Niggle, who loves to paint. And he is obsessed with the idea of painting this tree. He can kind of see it in his imagination. He wants to paint this tree, and he wants each leaf to be unique. And so he spends all his time thinking about how that should come together and how to make that vision a reality. But along the way, he's constantly beset by interruptions. Sometimes it'll be friends who are coming over, and it talks about, he invited them over 6 months ago, but now the day has come and, he wouldn't have invited them over now, but he has to host them anyways. He also gets interruptions from his neighbor, Parrish, who's always in need, has no interest in his art, no interest in his painting, but always wants him to go get the doctor or the builder or something like that. And so the beginning of the story is kind of this tension that Niggle feels between his creative work, what he wants to achieve, this great vision that he has, and then the kind of everyday demands and interruptions that he's facing from the people around him. But the story actually begins in a very interesting way. I'll just read you the first line. It says, "There once was a little man called Niggle who had a long journey to make. He did not want to go. Indeed, the whole idea was distasteful to him, but he could not get out of it. He knew he would have to start sometime, but he did not hurry with his preparations." So the book is set up in terms of this man who is supposed to be going on a journey, and the journey in this story represents death, but he doesn't want to go. And so the first part of the story is kind of before his journey, before his death, and it's exploring the tension that I've already talked about. After that, though, Niggle ends up having to go on his journey, and so we read kind of the second part of the story, which is really sort of Niggle in a sort of it's described as the infirmary, and it's sort of a purgatory idea. Tolkien, of course, is writing as a Roman Catholic, and so he's talking about Niggle's life after his death and how he's having to be purified and sanctified and learn from his life. And you see in that process that Niggle grows in self-awareness, where he kind of looked back on his life and saw that he had this great creative vision and there were all these interruptions. He also begins to see that he wasn't able to achieve that vision, not just because of other people's interruptions, but because he was often lazy, he was often distracted. And as he grows more and serves more, he begins to think less and less about himself and think more about his neighbors. And there's this interesting exchange where kind of these two voices, the first voice, which kind of represents the law, the second voice, which kind of represents the gospel, are discussing Niggle's case. Is he ready to move on or not? And as they talk with him, they hear in his voice that he is less obsessed with himself, more concerned about others. And so they say, okay, you're ready to kind of move on. And that kind of brings us to the third part of the book where, or the short story, where it kind of moves from his purgatory to kind of being in the foothills of heaven, is how I would put it. And what happens when he gets there is that he finds, standing in front of him in real life, the tree that he had always imagined painting but had never been able to paint. And only it's growing and it's dynamic. And he just stands in front of it and he says it's a gift. And then he wishes that his old neighbor Parrish, who was always good with plants, could be there with him to help care for this land and make it beautiful. And lo and behold, Parrish is there. And so you have these two characters that in life were neighbors and, did things for each other, but neither really understood the other, neither really appreciated the other. They kind of viewed each other as odd and interruptions. And now they're kind of repentant and they're working together and they make something beautiful. In fact, it becomes so beautiful that whole area comes to be known as Niggle's Parish. And then we have kind of the last little part of the book where we actually jump back to Earth, as it were, to real life. And you have these kind of bureaucrats who were discussing Niggle and what a useless man he was, and how he didn't really do anything of value. And there was the only thing that survived of his work was one little leaf that he had painted, which got framed and stuck in a museum, and it was just called Leaf by Niggle, which is where the title of the story comes from. But that itself kind of burned down when the museum burned down. And so the kind of final assessment of people on Earth is, Niggle was a useless little man, didn't even know he was a painter, doesn't really matter. And then you had the final scene of the story, which is actually the two voices again that we heard earlier talking about Niggle and saying, what he has made there, his creativity, his partnership with Parrish, all of these things is something that's become very useful, very beautiful, because it's been this way station for pilgrims as they're on their way to heaven, and has been something that has been used to prepare many people for heaven. And so there's kind of these two competing assessments of Niggle's work there at the end of his life. So what is the story all about? There's a whole lot to say. I won't do a whole literary analysis now, but people have often noticed that Tolkien is, in describing Niggle, kind of describing someone who's a picture of himself. He was a niggler by nature. He had to focus on the details. He was like that painter who has this grand vision that he wants to achieve, and all of his energy and effort gets tied up in that. And all of his work, he kind of has this line, just became part of the tree. And that's kind of a picture of Tolkien's mythology. If you know anything about Tolkien, he started with a few stories here and there, and then everything he ended up writing kind of got sucked into the realm of Middle-earth and his legendarium and all of that. And he was always someone who was revising and reworking and all of that. And he was not really sure he'd be able to achieve the vision that he had. In fact, interesting biographical detail, this story kind of came to Tolkien in the middle of the night. He kind of woke up with this idea, and in a couple hours he had written it down. He didn't revise it. That was not his normal process, right? He was a perpetual reviser and everything. But this just came to him, and he felt like it was a gift in 1939 or 1940, I think. I think it was 1940. And he showed the story to his friends, the Inklings. They kind of gave feedback, and then he just put it on the shelf. And it wasn't actually published until in 1945. A friend of his who edited the Dublin Review was asking him if he had any nonfiction that they could publish for that edition. And so he sent Leaf by Niggle, and it was published in 1945 in the Dublin Review. And then later was published in 1964 in his little book, Tree and Leaf. But what's interesting about that is that's in the middle of Tolkien trying to write out the Lord of the Rings trilogy. None of those had been published yet. He had written The Hobbit. It was very successful, but he was trying to extend that story. He was trying to paint the tree. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to finish it before he died. He wasn't sure how it would be received, if it would even matter. And this story comes to him in the midst of that process. And I think this is really a story about the value of obedience and vocation, and especially the abiding value of creative work when it's sanctified by God. It's a thoroughly Christian story, absolutely fascinating, and it has so much to say, obviously, to people who are artists or creators, but really to everyone. I think as parents, we struggle with this dynamic of we've got this picture of what we want to be or what we want to do in our vocation or in our life, but there are all these interruptions and things, and we're not sure if we can achieve our vision, and we're not sure what our legacy will be. And a lot of midlife crises are born of these kinds of dynamics. But in Leaf by Niggle, what Tolkien is recognizing is, first off, a lot of the things that we view as interruptions are not actually diversions. They are the quest. They are the point. In fact, there's this very interesting statement kind of once they get to the foothills of heaven and Niggle and Perish are there together, and Niggle begins to realize that as he's looking at this world, which is really kind of, I was going to say it's a reflection of the work that he was doing on Earth, but in many ways the work he was doing on Earth was a reflection or anticipation of what he's seeing now. But those things that he's seeing there in heaven, the tree and the leaves, he begins to realize that the most Niggle kind of works of that are things that were created in partnership with Perish. So it's inseparable, right? And of course, Parish, I think that name is significant. It's the community, it's the neighborhood, it's the parish, it's the church, it's the people around you. And so Tolkien is pointing us to the fact that a lot of the things that we view as distractions are actually central to our work and to what God has called us to do. So it changes the way we view those. It also helps us to see that a lot of our own sin is involved in holding us back, and that we have to be sanctified ourselves. But at the same time, in spite of that, God is able to use the things that we do, the service that we offer, to make things that are beautiful, to make things that are good, to make things that are true, and to use them to draw other people to himself. I'll just read you kind of in closing here the last part of the story where the two voices are reflecting on what is Niggle's legacy, what has he accomplished. And here's what we read. It says, "It's proving very useful indeed," said the second voice. "As a holiday and a refreshment, it is splendid for convalescence, and not only for that, for many it is the best introduction to the mountains." The mountains represent the beatific vision of seeing God, being in his presence. "It works wonders in some cases. I'm sending more and more there. They seldom have to come back." "No, that is so," said the first voice. "I think we shall have to give the region a name. What do you propose?" "Well, the porter settled that some time ago," said the second voice. "Train for Niggle's Parish in the Bay. He has shouted that for a long while now. Niggle's Parish. I sent a message to both of them to tell them." "What did they say?" "They both laughed. The mountains rang with it." And that's the kind of closing assessment that we're given. And so there's a lot there to unpack, but it's a phenomenal little story. You can read it in one sitting. If you love Tolkien, but you've not read this work, I think it's really important. I think it actually brings you kind of behind all of his other books to show you his thought process, his mindset, his theology of creativity that was driving the wonderful books that many of us are familiar with today. So I would highly recommend, if you haven't read it, look it up and get yourself a copy of Leaf by Niggle by J.R.R. Tolkien.